To my dearest friends, I am honored to welcome you back once more for a special overview covering the void-faring crews of the mighty Imperial Navy. We all know of the armies of the Imperial Guard or of the Space Marines, but very few of us will ever be granted with the chance to peer up through the clouds and to spy the indomitable battle fleets of the Navy, ever to patrol the void, to safeguard humanity from the nightmarish horrors who lurk out in the dark. It is almost impossible for us to comprehend the truly unimaginable scale of the Imperial battleships, with many of them being larger than some cities, and with the crew count of a combined fleet, sometimes eclipsing the entire populace of a small planet. Yet, this is utterly essential, for the ships are so behemothing that they will each require tens or even hundreds of thousands of souls just to operate them on the most basic level. But the mightiest of the Imperial vessels are relics of the dark age of technology, and so to lose even a single ship will be to suffer a truly irreparable blow, as both the Imperium and Mechanicus have lost the knowledge necessary to rebuild their sacred crafts. Nevertheless, the galaxy is not a peaceful place, and so the High Admirals will be forced to risk their most prized of assets, lest they sit idly by in their docks and watch as mankind falls beneath the ceaseless advance of those who have only ever sought our downfall. In any case, today we shall be exploring the topic of the Navy in more detail, and we will begin by giving a more in-depth overview on the Admiralty and of the role they serve within the Imperium. After, we will investigate the fearless crews who have chosen to leave the safety of their homes in the hopes of finding some purpose out in the cold void between uncaring stars. We will also look over the ships of the Navy before finally acting out some of the more common of scenarios which a crew will very likely be forced to face. But in any case, with this much to discuss, I do believe that it is now time for us to begin. Our journeys today will free us from the confines of our worlds to fly up into the inky depths of space as we join in the great armadas of the Imperial Navy. To begin with, we should broadly learn of what the Imperial Navy actually is, and of what purpose it serves within the grim darkness of the far future. The actual scale of the galaxy is truly mind-boggling, with there being an expanse of around 100,000 light-years between the westerly systems of Segmentum Pacificus all the way to the cold, forgotten region of the Ghoul stars, out past the eastern rim of Segmentum Ultima. Within this unimaginable ocean of darkness are the millions of stars and worlds which have been conquered and claimed by the Imperium of man. But such is their distance from one another that they are to be left in a precarious state, ever vulnerable to predation from the insidious enemies of all mankind. Thus, the Imperial Navy exists to serve as the long hand of humanity, outstretched through the void to safeguard the many worlds of the Imperium and to facilitate the ever-turning cogs of imperial bureaucracy. To be technical on the matter, the Navy is only the military arm of the Imperial Fleet, an organization which controls each and every space vessel of the Imperium, save for those owned by the Space Marines Mechanicus or Inquisition. In any case, however, the Lords of the Navy will direct the military craft to both defend humanity as well as to attack the spacefaring aliens, mutants and heretics, whose mere presence serves as a disgusting affront to all of mankind. Each world must pay a tithe to the Imperium, which can be viewed as a form of taxation, wherein which the High Lords of Terra will demand an allotment of manpower, resources, and other forms of material wealth. This will then be disseminated throughout the galaxy to fuel the great war machine of mankind, a task which must undoubtedly be quite a logistical nightmare. But the vessels of the Imperial Navy will often be tasked with accompanying the tithe-harvesting ships, both to protect them during their travels and also to intimidate any of the planetary governors who may arrogantly believe that they can shirk their payments and live freely within Imperial territory. It would be impossible to traverse the great distance of the galaxy at sublight speeds, and so all Imperial vessels will utilize arcane devices known as warp drives to tear a hole into the fabric of reality, allowing them to slip into the roiling madness of the immaterium. Both time and space move differently within the warp, and so a submerged ship will be able to travel for a relatively short distance, then drop back out into real space at their intended destination, having saved themselves several decades' worth of time in the process. A competent captain will find it rather trivial to make a jump of around 4 or 5 light years, but for larger distances, they will need to rely upon their navigators to steer them through the turbulent seas of the warp. The vessels will be protected by their Geller fields, but the crews should still be prepared to fend off a potential incursion of the hell-spawned demons, who will attempt to gnaw and chew through the outer shields in the hopes of claiming the succulent bounty of souls held within. But the dangers of the Great Abyss are not only to be confined to the nightmare of the warp, and in many ways reality itself can conceal horrors far darker than we would have otherwise thought possible. Vicious pirates, lawless corsairs, and bloodthirsty marauders will stalk the void, prowling amidst the cover of asteroid fields, or by simply laying low within the great nothingness found between distant stars. From here, they will launch their attacks, ferociously tearing into vulnerable Imperial vessels, bleeding them dry of their valuable cargo, while slaying the terrified crews within before scuttling the ruined crafts, leaving them to drift as barren graveyards to their cosmic banditry. With that said, the mercantile and civilian fleets of the Imperium are not to make their journeys alone, and they will almost always be accompanied by a small attachment of the Navy, who will move in to relentlessly purge the void from the taint of piracy. Returning to the vast scale of the galaxy, it can be quite difficult to oversee or manage the entirety of the Imperial fleet, and so, to aid in this organizational quandary, the Imperium has been split into 5 segmentum, namely the Segmentum Solar, Obscurus, Pacificus, Ultima, and Tempestus. Each of these will possess its own naval fleets, which are to be ultimately commanded by the Lord High Admirals, but we will cover these individuals in our next chapter. The segmenta are further broken down into sectors, which according to our sources will cover an irregular shape roughly stretched across a 200 light-year area of space. When we look at our maps, this may not seem so large, but we must acknowledge that in a 3-dimensional space, that this will equate to an area of around 8 million cubic light-years, often containing tens of thousands of stars, orbited by countless civilized and prosperous worlds of the Imperium. In any case, the sectors will then be divided into sub-sectors, now only around 10 or 20 light-years in diameter, which are typically centered upon the locus of an important Imperial star system, or perhaps simply around a lone planet, such as a bustling hive world, or a burning forge world. It is important to mention that not all of the galaxy will be codified according to this framework, and that there are still areas within Imperial space which are yet to be absorbed into a sector. These will be the regions that have been claimed by alien empires, revolutionary humans, or that have been overrun and decimated by forces beyond our mortal comprehension. Imperial cartographers will map out these areas as wilderness zones, and typically they will strongly advise, if not outright forbid, any mercantile or civilian crafts from charting a course through the wilderness, lest they tempt the ire of our stellar adversaries. As an interesting fact, the majority of the galaxy has been classified as a wilderness, meaning that we could almost visualize the territories of the Imperium as being more of a loose web, stretched over the abyssal void of the cosmos. Moving away from the wilderness, back into the harsh embrace of Imperial rule, we will find that the naval fleets of each segmentum have been subdivided into smaller groupings so that they may more efficiently cover a wider breadth of space. At the highest level, the entire armada for each segmentum will be known as a battle group, which, as we discussed, are under the command of the Lord High Admiral. This group will be divided into temporary formations known as battle fleets, which have been assembled to enact a grand operation, and they will be led by the Lord Admirals of the Navy. The battle fleets will typically be of a prodigious size, containing somewhere between 50 and 75 ships, though it is not unheard of for some of them to be considerably larger if the operation demands it. As an important note, the battleships, frigates, and cruisers of the fleet will be accompanied by a vast assemblage of smaller support vessels, including transportation shuttles, patrol ships, and scouting craft. Similarly, as the battle fleet moves into a local subsector, they will often be reinforced by the local fleets and stellar defenses, which are incapable of warp travel, yet their purpose is purely to defend the limited confines of their home system. Truly, the Navy is to be a ceaseless force within the void. During any given deployment, a fleet may be ordered to protect vulnerable shipping routes, then rapidly redirected to blockade a rebellious planetary governor, before finally being sent out on a retributive crusade against one of the many enemies of man. But these ships are not autonomous vessels, and we would be remiss to not spend our next chapter by exploring the intrepid and indomitable crews of the Imperial Navy. An erudite man once said that a ship has not one master, but many. And as we will now explore, I do believe that we will find this to be irrefutably true. The naval officers, for instance, who sternly deal out their orders and floggings, will still need to placate the trigger-happy agents of the commissariat, who in turn must be watchful of the lowly crewmen, who, if pushed to the extreme, may very well rise in a mutinous wave to claim the craft for themselves. Equally, the tech priests of the Mechanicus would like for nothing more than to hold the vessels in their shipyards, simply to bask in their glory. Through their holy affirmations of chanted binary, spoken to soothe the inbound machine spirits of the ship, they will quietly begrudge the parasitic presence of the human crews, who know not of their own affront, to this blessed gift of the machine god. But for now, we will look past the priesthood of Mars and turn our considerations to the humans who have committed themselves to a life spent out in the impossible void of space. Given the enormous size differential between the various vessels of the Imperial Navy, it can be quite tricky to give an accurate figure as to how many crew will be aboard each ship. Some older sources have suggested that the Emperor-class battleship, known as the Divine Right, was around 10 to 12 kilometers in length, and that it was manned by around 120,000 souls. Yet this feels rather meek by my estimation. We must remember that as the size of a ship increases, that its volume will scale cubically, meaning that the largest ships of the Navy will almost certainly require a crew many times larger than of the previously given figure. The Spirit of Conor, for instance, is a flagship which sits around 17 kilometers in length, and if we make some educated guesses on its internal volume and of the roles required for the ship to operate, we could reasonably estimate that it would require almost 1 million souls for its regular function. This is quite a mind-boggling figure for just one ship, and it poses further questions as to the logistical requirements for a crew of this scale. For instance, they would need a ghastly stockpile of basic supplies, including food, water, toiletries, medications, equipment, and all of the personnel will require their own quarters and bunks to sleep within. With that said, the ship will operate on a shift-based schedule, and so several mates may be assigned to the same bunk, forcing them to take turns sleeping whilst the other mate is out on duty. But we are getting lost in the weeds of stellar logistics, and whilst it might be interesting to spend an hour delving into this topic further, let us return to our course and try to learn a little more about the specific crew who operate the mighty vessels of the Navy. At the head of the entire military institution, we will find one individual who sits within the Senatorum Imperialis as a High Lord of Terror, and this will be the Lord High Admiral of the Navy. Typically, this figure will rule from Holy Terror itself, charting the overall course of the Admiralty to best align with the agreed-upon goals of the fellow High Lords. In addition, they will serve as the direct admiral to Battlefleet Solar, which contains the rarest and most powerful ships humanity has to offer, and will ultimately be in place to safeguard the birthplace of mankind from the horrors of the dark. Next in the rankings will be the 5 Lord High Admirals of the Segmenta, who, as the name suggests, are each responsible for commanding over the respective fleets from one of the Imperium's major segmenti. The Lord who is stationed within Segmentum Solar will typically be elevated to the rank of Lord Admiral of the entire Navy, purely because of the prestige associated with their post, though officially the admirals are all equal, and thus any may be selected for the distinguished role. Though they direct the overall strategy of the segmentum, they will delegate command over specific sectors to the subservient Lord Admirals, and of the subsectors to the more junior of admirals. Next will be the captains, who are to lead individual vessels directing the sprawling crews to steer the mighty barges and enact their wishes at but a moment's notice. A captain may be granted with the honorific rank of Lord Captain or Flag Captain if an admiral has dispatched them to perform a specific mission, separate from the main battle fleet. This title, though temporary, carries with it a great many boons, the most notable of which will be that the captain may speak with the authority of the entire battle fleet, which can be quite useful for intimidating pesky bureaucrats or arrogant planetary governors. But regardless of their specific titles, each captain will assign himself with a coterie of advisors, enforcers, priests, and other supplicant lackeys who are often promoted purely to give the captain with an aura of prestige and power. It is important to mention here that many of the captains will be drawn from a noble heritage, with the planet-bound aristocrats being quite keen to ship off their gentle relatives, partly to bolster the power of their dynasty, but also so that they may boast of the fact to their sneering rivals. As an extension of this point, if a noble family is particularly influential, then they may attempt to secretly seed their dynastic members across an entire armada, silently securing the allegiances of a battle fleet to an aristocrat who only wishes to further their own power across the Imperium. Alternatively, if an aristocrat wishes to rid himself of a dim-witted, bumbling, or just downright imbecilic relative, then they could simply make up a few sharp lies, bribe the Admiralty, and before they know it, the high-born whelp will be shipped off as the new captain of a mighty vessel. Unfortunately, during times of relative peace, the recruitment standards for officers tend to drop, so the blue-blooded curs of a segmentum fortress will find it far easier to push their friends and relatives into cushy positions within the Admiralty. Of course, when they are then sent to war, the highborns will often be summarily executed by the presiding agents of the Commissariat, who will be more than happy to purge the ship of its most inept and pathetic of incumbents. With that said, a prudent captain will do well to ingratiate himself with the senior officers, or to at least replace them with the loyal lackeys that he keeps in his personal circle of kiss-arse servants. One such way to do this would be to invite the crew to sit at the captain's table during a mealtime, an honor which most would do well to not forget. This is less intended to share in a bottle of vintage Amasec, or to indulge in the relatively fresh meats of dubious origin, and rather it will be to discuss the ever-shifting political landscape of their ship. The captain will want to hear that his crew is loyal and faithful to his service, but unfortunately he will rarely be given a straight answer. Rather, the invitees, in between gulps of liquor, will bloviate at extreme lengths on the gracious glory of their captain, conjuring up tales of grandeur, each trying to outdo the other with ever greater praises towards the smiling noble. In return for their saccharine support, the arrogant lord will dish out his promotions, granting the most faithful of servants with pompous titles, such as Supreme High Overlord of the Starboard Bow, a role which he himself will likely never remember creating. Naturally, the promoted individual will saunter off from the table, swanning his way back to his personal quarters, happy as can be, until, of course, he receives an urgent request from his captain, demanding that he report on the 0.1% derivation of plasma reactor efficiency, found only on the starboard side. Without a suitable explanation, his prior commendations will mean very little, and so the captain will call for a commissar to administer a public and near-lethal flogging to the rather confused and freshly demoted crewmate. Not all captains are so ruthless, however, and some are even known to be quite gracious to the lowly servants found within the lightless decks of their ship. Typically, these captains will have been promoted through the ranks based on the merit of their prior naval service, and so they will understand that a vessel will only reach its full capabilities if the entire crew is united under a sense of duty. No one will know of their captain's heritage until being enlisted upon their ship, but according to the naval voidsman, there is a fairly legendary rivalry held between the admirals who can draw from a noble lineage and of the dutiful sailors who earned their stripes through hardship and turmoil. With this, we should move to the topic of the commissars, who are figures which some scholarly fellows would consider to be the immutable masters of the ship. They will typically be found standing vigil over the lesser crewmates of the craft, donned in an immaculate black greatcoat lined with a fine red fabric and adorned with the cold silver skulls of the Imperium. They will truly be an iconic and hard-to-miss sight upon the deck. Hand-chosen from the most uncompromising of students from the Schola Progenium, they will be expected to take on a multitude of roles, making them part enforcer, part intimidator, and at times as the unofficial spy masters of the ship. The assigned commissar will be accompanied by his own retinue of juniors, who will be more than happy to weed out the weakest, or borderline heretical of elements, to be found amidst the expansive manifest of the crew. Interestingly, they have been known to bribe vulnerable crewmates to divulge sensitive information on the craft, or to point out dissident mates, who will quickly be taken care of, along with the poor individual who took the bribe, ignorant to his own participation in their criminal behaviors. But the commissars will not only be deployed to deal with mutinous events, as they are to also enforce the strict standards which have upheld the Navy ever since the days of the Great Crusade. If a mate is found out of uniform, or is not giving his appropriate respects to the senior officers, then the commissar will pluck them from duty and administer a public flogging, making an example of the insolent Voidfarer for all to see. From time to time, it is to be expected for the lowly mates to occasionally fall behind in their duties, but if a commissioned officer is caught slacking, or is generally disrespecting his venerable post within the Admiralty, then the commissars will be forced to step in and show no mercy. With very little spectacle this time, they will pull the officer aside, unholster their bolt pistol, and execute the wayward noble on the spot before summoning the individual next in line to their position and ordering them to clean up the body, clearly as a message to dissuade them from making the same mistakes as their predecessor. Moving away from the false aristocracy of captains and commissars, let us turn our attention to the only individuals aboard the naval vessels who could be considered as true nobles, and these would be none other than of the navigators. We previously covered these mutants in a prior sermon, but in brief, they are abhumans who possess the rare gift of warp sight, meaning that they can peer into the nightmare of the immaterium and chart a safe course for their ship, making them the perfect pilots for the ships of the Navy. They will be recruited from the houses of the Navis Nobilitae, an ancient group which preserves the incomprehensible wealth, power, and influence of the navigators, who have existed as a protected and independent group since long before the Imperium ever first took form. Once appointed to a craft, the enigmatic psychers will be granted with their own personal chambers and will generally be afforded with superior luxuries comparable to the captain's, though this is more than worth it considering that none other aboard the ship could possibly attempt to replace them in their duties. Unfortunately, the rest of the crew will typically treat the navigators with a great deal of suspicion, seeing them as freaks of nature who have manipulated the trust of the High Lords, and who should have otherwise been stamped out and exterminated long ago. Furthermore, there is an old myth which has pervaded the entirety of the Navy, stating that if one is to match the Stygian gaze of a navigator's warp eye, that something otherworldly will be sure to stare back, bearing deep into the soul of the poor fool who trusted the intolerable mutant. This, however, is simply not true, as if one were to truly stare into the third eye of a navigator, then they would almost assuredly be killed in an instant. This is because their eye exists as a direct gateway into the roiling madness of the warp, and so to look within that abyssal portal would be to expose yourself to the raw, unshielded potential of the immaterium, rending their feeble minds down into little more than a soup, with naught but abject terror carved into their lifeless face. Astropaths will play a similar role to the navigators in that they are also psychers, though they are tasked with listening out for the distant communiques of fellow Imperials, keeping the ship abreast of the passing events found out across the galaxy. They will typically form themselves into a choir so as to best amplify their psychic song, though out of the group one will always be designated as the chief astropath, and it will fall to them to hold direct dealings with the captain. Interestingly, much of what is discussed between the captain and his chief astropath will be inherently sensitive information, and so their meetings will always take place behind closed doors and away from the prying eyes of even the most trusted of advisors. As a result of this, the two will often form quite a strong bond with one another, with the Psyker typically asserting himself as the captain's most trustworthy and secretive of confidants. The most junior of astropaths, however, will share in none of the glory, and rather their days will be spent in near ceaseless choir, chanting out their psychic songs to echo through the void, only to be heard if someone truly cares enough to listen. Others will quietly recite prayers or refill incense burners around their quarters, and whilst they are mostly harmless, the wider crew will hold a general disdain to their presence, seeing them in much of the same way as the navigators, in that they are foul witches who are not to be trusted. The figures we have discussed will make up less than 1% of the total crew manifest of an Imperial vessel, and the vast majority of the souls found upon a void ship will be of the common mates, deckhands, voidsmen, and of the indentured servants who are ultimately responsible for maintaining and operating all functions found upon the craft. From the smallest of mercantile vessels all the way up to the largest of battleships, the common workers exist as the unheralded backbone of the Navy, ever working away in their silent, unending toil. Their tasks are too many to list, but some will be responsible for performing painstaking maintenance work on the corroded bulkheads, whereas others will need to set out in great teams to polish the inner tubes of colossal torpedo bays. The crew, referred to as voidsmen, are typically those who have received some form of technical training, most often gained from their youth upon their homeworld. Hive, or Forge Worlders, will be the best candidates here, as they will likely already be familiar with the concept of advanced technology, as opposed to a feral worlder who may very well have never even seen a cogitator before. In any case, they will be given maintenance tasks which require a modicum of care, such as by polishing the fine collection of authentic Terran silverware, proudly owned by the captain. Armsmen will be the crew who come from a military background, and as such, they will be equipped with weapons before being sent out on patrol, maintaining order and discipline throughout the ship. The lowly shipmates will often jump at the chance of becoming an armsman, since they will have a relatively easy job, free from the hard labors of lugging around heavy machinery, and yet this task will carry with it a burden which they may never truly be able to shed. For you see, whilst out on patrol, they will often be ordered to take out their truncheons and to beat any lazy workers into submission, or to fire into a crowd of dissidents, mowing them down just to remind them of the captain's authority. Thus, it can weigh heavy on one's soul to know that they have sold out their void-faring neighbors and families just to become the weapon of tyranny which brutalizes and terrorizes those who thought they could find freedom out in the cold expanse of the stars. The crew of an Imperial vessel who perform the most basic of functions are known as the ratings, and whilst their jobs may be less technical, they are by no means less valuable than of any other mate. They will pass the hours by lugging about shells, dense cables, crates of ammunition, or by simply moving the captain's furniture, a task which, if lucky, will allow them to peer out from the great windows of their chamber and stare into the dazzling vista of our galaxy. Compared to a life in the Imperial Guard, a naval rating will be relatively comfortable, with their lifespan being several times longer and their conditions often being far more favorable. A crewmate will earn a decent wage aboard their new home, And if you are lucky enough to be stationed upon a great battleship, then their outer shields will often be enough to protect you from the horrors of war. Thus, it is quite common for crewmates to volunteer themselves for service, and yet the Admiralty possesses a truly ravenous hunger for new and eager workers. Thus, if needed, a captain may set down his ship upon an imperial world and send out a press gang to round up any able-bodied citizens who will be pressed into service whether they like it or not. Similarly, entire districts of a penal colony will be emptied, with tens of thousands of hardened criminals being shackled and sent aboard, where they will be forced to scrub the decks until the end of their miserable lives. Though they have much to do, there are some jobs which are utterly forbidden to the lowly humans, and which can only be performed by the mechadendrite appendages of a mechanicus tech priest. We must remember that many of the ships within the Imperial Navy are ancient treasures, preserved from the dark age of technology, yet mankind no longer has the means nor blueprints to recreate such vessels from scratch. As such, there can be no mistakes and no experimentation when it comes to the maintenance of relics such as the warp drives, reactor cores, or even of the colossal engine bays. Only the tech priests will carry out these duties, and they will happily hold the vessel in port for several years at a time, purely so that they can bask in the technological glory of the machine god's gift unto the worthy cultists of Mars. But in any case, there are many more minor roles to be played upon a ship, but they will have to wait for a future sermon. As for now, I believe that we should zoom out a little and take a closer look at the mighty ships themselves. The Imperial Navy, as we discussed, is the military branch of the Imperial fleet, but we must understand that there are a great many distinct classes of vessel which exist within its armadas that have been outfitted to serve a very specific purpose in the defense of all mankind. To expand upon a previous point on the rarity of these craft, we must first take a brief history lesson and look back through the annals of time to the forlorn golden age of humanity. It was during a time, now labeled as the Dark Age of technology, where mankind arose as the dominant masters of the galaxy, producing many forbidden treasures, including sentient artificial intelligences, warp drives, and standard template constructs. But alongside such relics were their tools of war, and given that we had ascended as a spacefaring civilization, many of these advancements were related to starships and voidcraft. Colossal battleships, the likes of which our species had never before seen, were erected en masse and launched out of system-spanning shipyards to be accompanied by an auxiliary armada of support vessels, each works of art in their own right. But with the onset of the AI rebellions and with the chaos brought about by the long night, our ancestors lost the schematics and methods needed for constructing such crafts, meaning that as each one was destroyed, that it was to be forever lost to the cold immensity of the void. Those which survived into the age of the Imperium were to be preserved as the most precious of humanity's old treasures, and it has now ultimately fallen to the Mechanicus to maintain the arcane workings of each ship, even if they themselves are befuddled by the impossible machinery. They cannot even take the risk of disassembling some of the rare components, as if it becomes damaged, then the vessel may be rendered functionally useless. Thus, much of their maintenance work is more spiritual, with the priests wafting oily incense and chanting out canticles of holy binary in order to soothe the fabled spirits within. With that said, it tends to only be the largest or most advanced of void ships which fall under this ancient category, and in fact, the many dockyards of the Mechanicus are still able to produce an impressive selection of the ships commonly found within the Navy. This makes a lot of sense, for the Imperium cannot reliably defend itself only with their limited stock of irreplaceable crafts, and so the rare treasures of the Dark Age will only make up a limited portion of the vessels found within a battle fleet. But they tend to be the largest and most powerful of craft available to the Imperium. And so rather than being used as any other vessel, they will be hand-chosen to serve as the flagships for Lord Admirals, or to be the mobile fortress monasteries for fleet-based chapters of the Space Marines. As an example of this, let us look upon one of the rarest of patterns, found in the Gloriana class of battleship. Around the time of the Great Crusade, there were roughly 20 of these behemoths ships found scattered out through the galaxy. And as each one was recovered, the Emperor gifted them to his sons, with the intent on them serving as the flagships for each of his legions. Some were later destroyed during the chaos of the Horus Heresy, or were captured and claimed by rival legions. But as it so stands today, they are incredibly rare, and they will only be found within an engagement if the ruling admirals believe that their strength will provide the only possible route to victory. Returning to the wider fleet, however, we must consider that the size of the naval ships will vary wildly, ranging from these colossal crafts being crewed by up to 1 million souls, all the way down to tiny single-manned fighters deployed out as a great field to swarm and harass larger vessels. In terms of the absolute largest of spacefaring craft controlled by the Navy, it would likely fall to the Ramil's class of Star Fort, which are semi-stationary stellar fortresses that can move via warp travel to be relocated to wherever is in dire need of defense. But I personally wouldn't count these as ships, and so instead the largest vessel in the history of the Navy would be the Abyss class of battleship, dwarfing the Great Gloriana class in their size, and being comparable in scale to the Imperial Fist's Fortress of the Phalanx. There were only ever 3 of these produced, and each of them was used by the Word-bearers during the Great Crusade, though with their fall to heresy, one was destroyed, and the remaining 2 have gone missing, likely lost within the chaos of the Eye of Terror. Both the Abyss and Gloriana class were confined to the armadas of the Astartes. But for the Imperial Navy, we could perhaps claim that the largest ship found in their modern-day fleets would be of the Apocalypse class of battleship. These are also relics of the Dark Age of technology, and we will only find a scant few within the battle fleets of each segmentum, yet their presence will most assuredly turn the tides of battle, perhaps only requiring a single shot from their ancient Nova cannon. This weapon lives up to the ship's namesake as apocalyptic, in that it will fire its gigantic projectiles at relativistic speeds, meaning that they travel close to the speed of light, all but assuring that its targets will be utterly obliterated by even a glancing strike. The recoil produced from such a shot can only be compensated by setting the battleship's rear engines to full thrust, and we can imagine that if this cannon was fitted onto a smaller craft, that it may be entirely torn apart just from the force of firing the weapon. In any case, the actual projectile can vary between cannons, often being armed at the behest of the presiding captain. Some will be fitted to fire out plasma bursts, burning with the intensity of a newborn star, whereas others will contain experimental gravity-based explosives, though it can be quite tricky to time the detonation when the warhead is set to be fired at near light speed. Regardless of the round, Nova cannons have been known to utterly destroy enemy battleships of a greater size than of the Apocalypse class from but a single shot, with the ruined husk of the vessel being torn apart and cast out into the void at unimaginable speeds. As a special note, I will mention the ship class known as the Universe Mass Conveyor, which is around 12 kilometers long, and in addition to its normal crew manifest, it can carry around 500,000 passengers, making it the vessel of choice for transporting the armies of the Imperial Guard. The cultists of Mars, however, hold their largest ships as the Arc Mechanicus, which are primarily used by obsessive explorators who wish to uncover the many technological secrets of the galaxy. The Speranza is one such vessel which, according to legend, harbors a sentient machine spirit, a damaged STC database, and a weapon which can be used to fire black holes to send its targets back through time. Moving down in scale, we will find the grand cruisers of the Imperium, which are heavily reinforced craft built to around 7.5 kilometers in length that exist to unleash salvos in a far closer range than of the battleships. With their prodigious size and crew count climbing into the hundreds of thousands, they are still mighty vessels which could very well eclipse the flagships of many alien species who will scarcely comprehend that a ship of this scale will be risked during close engagements. Further down, we reach the cruisers, which can be subdivided between the heavy and light variants. They will typically make up the backbone of a naval fleet, being multi-purpose vessels that can be outfitted in a wide range of classes to specialize an armada to the exact demands of the ruling admiral. The most common type of ship to be found, however, will be the destroyers. Sometimes named as frigates or escorts, they will number in the dozens, sometimes even hundreds for the largest of battle fleets, and their role will be to defend the larger, more valuable ships by harassing the most dangerous vessels the enemy has at their disposal. They are also typically sent out on reconnaissance missions, scouting out ahead of the main fleet to uncover hidden dangers or to simply defend a small convoy as it passes through hostile territory. At the smallest scale, we have the attack craft, some of which will only be controlled by a single pilot. They will be unleashed in great squadrons, often used to defend larger vessels from enemy bombing runs, or to perform daring sorties against the most vulnerable points of an enemy fleet. There are many more classes and subclasses of ship to mention, but our selection has covered the most common vessels to be found in the Imperial armadas. For now, however, let us return to the grimy decks and learn a little more about the typical scenarios which a crew may be forced to face whilst out on patrol in the lightless abyss. Before we begin, we must realize that unless one has sold their soul for the immortal gifts of the warp, that time governs all. Life aboard a naval vessel can at times be quite slow, with mates spending decades out on patrol, with the only interesting occurrence being the sight of a distant Leviathan, silently vanishing into the dense clouds of a nebula. Thus, to keep their crews sane, the captains will set out an ordered schedule, ensuring that each sweat-soaked hour is distinct from the last, staving off the ever-present risks of calenture within the ship. Derivations in time will often be the first sign that the ship has fallen to the influences of the warp, and so the officer of the watch will strictly break up the day into regular 4-hour periods known as watches. The crews will then be divided into roughly equal teams and will replace one another come the end of their watch, ensuring that all tasks upon the ship are constantly being fulfilled, but also that each crewmate has plenty of time to rest their mind and recover from the horrors of the void. With that said, there can never be true rest for one caught adrift in the abyss. One's sleep will be punctuated by the slumbering screams of their bunkmates, yelling out in abject terror as the existential dread of their post finally sinks in. At times, you may awaken in the dark just to spy a prowling crew member hunched over, stumbling from one too many huffs of promethium, only for them to be promptly executed by a merciless commissar. Your time off duty may even be disrupted by the mutinous uprising of a chaos cult, formed amidst the crew after a particularly rough bout of warp travel, with the cultists each screaming out that they can feel the warp overtaking them, and that it is a good pain. In a ship with a crew count climbing into the hundreds of thousands, you can be sure that at any given moment, that somewhere on the ship, someone is conspiring to further their own position at the detriment of their fellows. The commissars, whilst effective, cannot always be present to quell such criminal activities, but thankfully, they do not have to be the sole enforcers to the ship. The crew designated as armsmen will be allowed access to an armory, providing them with naval patterns of las guns, autoguns, and shotguns. They will then be sent out on patrol, partly to keep the other mates in line, but also to act as the first and often last line of defense against any infiltrative attacks upon the ship. If they stumble upon a mutinous band of renegades, or simply find an errant stowaway in the cargo bay, then they will have a duty to stand and fight, hopefully slowing the dastards, until the better equipped voidsmen-at-arms or commissars can respond for duty. Now, whilst an Imperial vessel provides a good deal of protection to those within, we must acknowledge that it is a rather common tactic amidst naval battles to break open a hole in the enemy vessel and send in a boarding crew to conquer the ship from within. Typically, a cruiser will position itself in close range to a target before firing out a series of boarding pods, transportation shuttles, or manned torpedoes which will slam into the outer hull before burrowing deeply into the bowels of the ship, unleashing squads of naval specialists to wreak havoc throughout the craft. In the case of an Imperial battleship being perhaps 15 kilometers long, with over 100,000 crew within, you would imagine that the armed mates would swarm the intrusive boarding party, like bees defending their hive from a hornet. But these troops have been specially trained and outfitted to inflict the maximum possible damage in the shortest possible time, whilst also remaining evasive and hidden from the ship's crew. The naval admirals are well familiar with breaches leaving trails of explosives in vulnerable areas, or for pernicious aliens to scuttle about, leaving clutches of eggs hidden in dark corners, which will only gestate and burst open several months after this battle has concluded. Naturally, the crews will do what they can with the aforementioned arms at their disposal, but we must realize that a humble shipmate armed with a naval shotgun has very little chance of surviving an encounter with a Chaos Terminator, which has just materialized at the foot of his bunk. The Navy will train its own breaching teams to be fired into enemy vessels, and they will carry quite an interesting array of equipment to aid them in their disruptive tasks. Hatch cutters and axe jacks will use their chain fists and axes to cleave through protective bulkheads, revealing vulnerable systems of the ship, which may then be blown to shreds by a precise explosive blast, lain by a grenadier. Surveyors will map out the internals of the craft with their cat drones, whilst void jammers shield their own presence and send out explosive drones built out of the skulls of fallen voidsmen to sabotage distant targets. These specialists will be defended by the Endurance, carrying heavy shotguns and boarding shields, who will form a defensive blockade behind which heavy gunners will unleash salvos of fire to clear a walkway of any measly crew who stand against them. It will be obvious to most of you that within a void battle, the aforementioned boarding actions will only play a relatively minor role when compared to the sheer carnage brought about by the ship's primary weapons. Each and every ship will be bristling with extensive batteries of weapon systems ranging from macro cannons firing colossal explosive shells to plasma projectors which hurl superheated bolts of matter burning as brightly as the core of a newborn star. The Macrag's Honor, for instance, being the flagship of the Indomitus Crusade, is 26 kilometers long, and so it can sport a truly terrifying mass of armaments, making it almost able to contend with entire enemy fleets by itself. But in any case, when two rival fleets encounter one another, then they will be quick to turn their weapons upon one another and light up the darkness of the void with such intensity that they will surely outshine the blazing lights of all but the closest of stars. Macro shells and void torpedoes will roar to life, tearing through the darkness like furious beasts, shattering enemy hulls, with each explosion to send a deadly shockwave through the craft, decimating the crews with each well-timed shot. Ancient bulkheads, once thought of as impenetrable, will melt away into globs of molten slag, liquefied from the searing bolts of plasma and arcs of long-range laser fire. In these moments, entire sections of a battleship may be reduced to nothing more than smouldering debris, destined to now drift through the void, as the frigid gravestones to the nameless crewmates lost from the fated battle. The captains and admirals will chart ever more daring courses through the maelstrom of their engagement, steering the mighty barges through the now blazing void of death in their desperate attempts to outflank and expose a rival ship to their fully loaded batteries. Critical systems such as shield generators, engines, or life support systems will be specifically targeted by the crews hoping to cripple their foe before they themselves are engulfed by a similar attack. If a warp drive is destroyed, or if the navigators and astropathic choirs are killed, then the ship will be hamstrung from travel, and so, even if it survives the current engagement, it will be cursed to simply drift through the void, likely to become a fabled ghost ship or, in time, to crash and meld with a larger space hulk. With that said, if an Imperial ship has survived its conflict, with its engines and structural integrity kept intact, then it will be able to resume its journey, and for this, its captain may ordain for the ship to leave this plane of reality and prepare for warp travel. For starters, the ship will need to be steered to the outer borders of the local star system, to a location known as the Mandeville Point, where the gravitational influence of nearby orbital bodies is at its lowest, thus minimizing the risk of being caught in a gravity well and cast astray into the warp. The captain, along with their first officers and commissars, will be out on patrol, conducting their final inspections, though in truth this is more intended to boost the fading morale of the crew, as all aboard the vessel will understand that in a short few hours that they will be plunged into the literal depths of hell. Any who are driven to a state of panic will be swiftly removed from sight and executed lest they frighten the rest of the crew, who will need to steel themselves against the horrors soon to come. The captain himself may at this point begin to sweat fearing for the task ahead. Yet warp jumps are a necessary part of space travel, and so even the noble figure will need to pull himself up by his boots and strap in for the waking nightmare of the warp. All areas of the ship, even if usually peaceful, will be swept up in a frenzied rush of acolytes, frantically chanting out hymns of preservation and purification, sanctifying every last corner of the ship and purging even the faintest traces of evil from its dusty holds. Any colossal viewports or arched windows will be sealed away behind metallic shutters, blocking the otherwise magnificent view of the cosmos so as to protect the crew who may foolishly think that it is safe to peer out and stare into the roiling madness of the warp. After a lengthy ritual, the tech priests will rouse the warp drives from slumber, and as they activate, the most sensitive of crew members will begin to feel tiny needle pricks behind their eyes as the borders between this plane and the next rapidly begin to thin. All non-essential crewmates will now be ordered to retreat deeper into the craft and to strap themselves into safety harnesses, their own rushed breathing soon to be drowned out by the rising cacophony of prayers booming across the ship, chanted by the choirs of priests, each fearful that their best efforts won't be enough to save them. As this reaches its crescendo, and as the captain gives his final command, the warp drives will let out an immense roar of energy, rending a hole in reality itself, behind which lies the impossible hellscape of the warp. As roaming commissars execute those who are lost to the sudden chaos, the ship's engines will flare into life, plunging the ship into the rift, where it will vanish from the material universe, and the portal behind it will seal shut forevermore. The Geller fields will then flicker on, preventing the ravenous entities of the warp from feasting upon the delectable and succulent souls within. But from this point on, none of the crew truly matter, and all of their lives will now be in the hands of the mutant navigator, who must steer this mighty barge through the tempestuous storm of psychic fury until they finally reach their intended destination. Jumps of around 4 to 5 light years can be performed almost instantaneously, but for distances larger than this, the navigator will need to contend with the ebbing tides of the warp for hours, days, or even weeks at a time. Yet there are none more suited for the task than of the mutants. Guided by the light of the Astronomicon, they will sail the sea of souls, until at long last they will signal to the captain that they have arrived. And as the warp drives roar into life once more, the ship will be ejected from the chaos of the warp, finally to be reunited with the lands of the living. At this point, the captain and their crew may let out a sigh of relief, for they have survived an ordeal most horrific. But they will ever bear the scars of their journey as silent nightmares, for none may venture into the warp and truly emerge unscathed. We have only just scratched the surface of what there is to be known on the subject of the Imperial Navy, and in truth we could spend countless more hours learning of the many intricacies which pervade this galaxy-spanning organization. For instance, with the crews we could return to speak on the tech priests, where only the most senior of magi will be permitted to commune directly with the enigmatic machine spirits which lurk within the ships of the Dark Age. The sheer age and power of the spirits which inhabit the ancient battleships can be truly overwhelming to junior priests, shorting out the circuitry of their cybernetic minds, leaving them as a smoking heap of a fool who tried to make contact with a veritable god. Similarly, we touched on the topic of logistics, but in a ship with a crew count of even 100,000, we must consider that they would need a gargantuan stockpile of supplies to provide each mate with an adequate supply of nutritious gruel. Then there would be the question of washing and waste disposal, and of water recycling, air purification, and of the entertainment available during rec time. There would also be the constant political feuding held between rival factions, such as the ecclesiarchy or naval nobility, who themselves would need to contend with the tight-knit crews, ever waiting for their chance to rise up and claim the craft for themselves. Perhaps when we next investigate the Navy, we will explore the crew in more detail, as the life of a naval crewmate is truly a rather fascinating topic. Alternatively, many of you will be wondering as to why I failed to mention the void-faring rascals known as rogue traders at any point during our sermon. The reason behind this is that they are technically not a part of the Imperial Navy, and rather they fall outside of the official purview of the Lords, acting more as mercenary explorers, being paid to perform specific tasks or to expand the borders of the Imperium, with very little in the way of oversight. They will have the freedom to go where they wish, and to speak with the same authority held by a chapter master of the Space Marines, to establish new trade routes, discover new worlds for colonization, or to simply map out the wilderness and to bring the light of the Emperor to even the darkest corners of the void. We must also consider that, from all that we have learned, that there will be equivalent points on the rival species and empires of the galaxy. The Orcs, for instance, will have their own crude hierarchies within their fleets, though it most often falls back on their classic view that the biggest, greenest and meanest of Orcs should rightly claim the mantle of command. Conversely, the Tau ships are only to be operated by the members of the air caste. But I would very much doubt that they appoint any of their crewmates with equivocal roles to the commissariat of the Imperium. But in any case, I do believe that those topics will have to wait for another day, as it seems that we have now come to our end. Thank you all for joining me on this investigation into the Imperial Navy, and for listening to this sermon in its entirety. For now, however, I must once again close this chapter, and so, as I go, I will leave you all with a very warm goodbye.